British. Okay, and then on the next page, we have fast forwarded quite a bit, and we now have a picture that depicts the founding of modern Canada in 1867. This is a famous painting of the 19th century politicians who wrote the modern Canadian Constitution. They are called the Fathers of Confederation, sort of Canada's founding fathers moment. And we can see at the top here, there is a little quotation. It says, "A great nation, great in thought, great in action, great in hope, and great in position." And it is by the Right Honourable Sir John A. Macdonald. And the Right Honourable Sir John A. Macdonald was the first Prime Minister of Canada. He is actually the man standing right here in this window. I find it a little bit funny that the passport's history skips straight from the French explorers founding the colony of New France to the Constitution of Canada being written in 1867. It really sort of glosses over everything that happened between those two dates, the most notable of which was, of course, the British conquering French Canada. Okay, and then on the next page, we have two photos. We have a photo of a train, and we have a photo of a guy hammering a spike into a railroad. And then it says, "The Last Spike, 1885. So this is another very, very famous photo from Canadian history. It might even be the most famous photograph in Canadian history, I would say. So when John A. Macdonald became the first Prime Minister of Canada in 1867, after the modern Constitution of Canada was adopted, he had this very ambitious plan, which was to build a railroad from one end of Canada, from the easternmost part of Canada, all the way to here in Vancouver in British Columbia. And this was an extraordinarily ambitious sort of engineering project for its time. I mean, this was the Victorian era. This was before telephones and this sort of thing. He wanted to build this enormous, enormous railroad. And, you know, people said it couldn't be done and blah, blah, blah. But, you know, he did it, and he built it in 5 years. Now, there was a lot of corruption, a lot of shenanigans, you know, a lot of exploitation of Aboriginal people and cheap Chinese slave labor, basically, to get it done. But it was done, and it was done in only 5 years. And it was considered this very heroic accomplishment for this new nation of Canada to build a railroad of this magnitude across the entire North American continent. And when it was finished in 1885 here in British Columbia, there was this big photo op, The Last Spike. They got the Governor General of Canada and the president of the railroad to hammer in the final spike in BC. And it was this big deal because it showed, you know, John A. Macdonald's triumph and sort of the triumph of the new Canadian nation. You know, this country of enormous size was able to be unified by the most modern form of transportation that existed in those days. On the next page, we have a depiction of Canada's northernmost territories. This is a picture of the Northwest Territories and the Nunavut Archipelago, the northernmost part of the North American continent, which belongs to Canada. And then there is a little photograph here of Joseph Eleazar Bernier, and a dotted line which depicts his expedition from 1906 to 1913. Now, I do not think that your average Canadian is very familiar with Joseph Eleazar Bernier, but, you know, one of the themes of this passport is that we have to, you know, give the French Canadians equal billing to the English Canadians. You know, the northern part of Canada has, of course, been this very inhospitable, you know, very isolated, very mysterious part of the world. And the Canadian efforts to sort of tame and control and understand it have sort of been a big part of the Canadian story. So when modern ship technology sort of got more advanced in the early 20th century, there was a lot of interest in getting ships to sort of sail around the Nunavut Archipelago and sort of navigate and document and also stake a claim to this territory as belonging to Canada, sort of create this idea that Canada understood the area well enough to claim ownership of it. This is actually still a contentious matter to this day, just because it is still a very mysterious area where humans don't often tread. But, you know, that there's all this kind of thinking about that there might be oil there might be natural resources there. So Canada really sort of needs to show that it has a claim to this territory and that it can enforce its sovereignty over this territory if it is ever contested by other countries. The purpose of why this is in the passport is to kind of reinforce this narrative, this idea that Canada has had a historical claim to this area. Canadians have always been interested in sort of this part of the world, and I suppose that you know, it's a tradition that includes our French-Canadian friends as well as the Anglo-Canadians. All right, on the next page, we have the Canadian prairies. And so we see that there's a train. This is probably on John A. Macdonald's famous railroad. There are oil derricks in the background. There is wheat. There is a grain elevator. You know, the Canadian prairies were settled in the 19th century. Lots of immigrants, particularly from Eastern Europe, settled this very open, empty part of the continent. You know, they created farms, homesteading, this sort of thing. And their ability to make it an agriculturally prosperous part of North America is considered this great success story. You know, the Canadian wheat fields provide a lot of wheat for the world. The Canadian oil fields in the prairies of Canada are very important as well economically for Canada. Some of the world's largest oil reserves can be found in the prairies of Canada. Another theme of this passport is sort of appeasing all of the regions of Canada, making everyone feel like, you know, you're included and you're appreciated, your contributions. All right, on the next page, we have Pier 21. Halifax, historic gateway to Canada. So we see a big cruise liner and then we see a dock over here. Canada is, of course, a country of immigrants. We all come from somewhere. And during the 20th century, there was a large inflow of Canadians from various parts of the world, from Europe in particular. And, you know, in the old days, people didn't just hop on airplanes. They had to actually get on boats and sail from Europe to Canada. And the entry point for a lot of Europeans who arrived on the shores of Canada was Pier 21 in Halifax, which is the most sort of easternmost port. My own mother, who is an immigrant from Holland, this is how she actually came to Canada. She came on a boat from Holland in like the 1960s, sailed over, came to Pier 21, lived in Halifax for a while before she emigrated here to Vancouver. So Pier 21 is this very sort of romanticized entry point. It's sort of like Ellis Island in the United States. This idea that a lot of immigrants to Canada, this was their first sort of glimpse of what their new life was going to be like. And so it is sort of this symbolic kind of romanticized image, as of course, you know, immigration is still a very large part of Canada's reality today. And there is also a quote here at the top. It says, "Canada is free and freedom is its nationality. The Right Honourable Sir Wilfrid Laurier." So Sir Wilfrid Laurier was another Prime Minister of Canada. He was the first French-Canadian Prime Minister of Canada. He was Prime Minister for, I think, about 15 years in sort of the late 19th century, early 20th century. Considered a very sort of iconic statesman of Canadian history. Although, I do think that he's an interesting guy because I don't think that people really know that much about what he did in particular. He's just sort of a man associated with late 19th century Canada at a time when the country was really sort of growing and thriving. All right, next page. We have the Parliament buildings of Canada. So this is Canada's most famous architectural masterpiece. This is the Parliament buildings in Ottawa. It's this enormous neo-Gothic sort of building in Canada's capital in Ontario. There is this enormous clock in the middle, the so-called Peace Tower. The central block of Parliament is also what it's called. That's what it says right down here. The Peace Tower separates the two wings of the Canadian Parliament. You have the House of Commons on this side and then the Senate on this side. And then there is another quote up here that says, "Parliament is more than procedure. It is the custodian of the nation's freedom. The Right Honourable John Diefenbaker." So John Diefenbaker was a conservative Prime Minister of Canada in the late 50s, early 60s. He was sort of a controversial and contentious figure, very sort of erratic, had sort of a very odd personality. But he was also a great romantic of Parliament, you know, very defensive of Parliament's traditions and so forth. So this line here that Parliament is more than procedure, it is the custodian of the nation's freedom, that is a very sort of Diefenbaker kind of sentiment. The interesting thing about Diefenbaker is that even after losing election, he still hung around in Parliament for a very long time until his death in 1979. So he was very much considered sort of the Grand Dean of the House, you know, a man with a lot of institutional reverence and knowledge, and I'm sure no one considered himself more that way than Dief himself. All right, on the next page, we have the iconic Niagara Falls of Ontario. I think everybody knows Niagara Falls. It is one of the most famous tourist attractions in Canada. This enormous, enormous waterfall. I actually had the chance to visit Niagara Falls a few years ago. It was quite a cool thing to see. You can go on a little boat and sail all the way through the mist at the bottom of the falls. I think at one time they claimed that Niagara Falls was like the honeymoon capital of the world. But I must say that Niagara Falls is also like a really, really tacky tourist trap. Like, it might look beautiful in these photographs, but if you are away from the falls themselves, everything is just like tacky restaurants and like wax museums and like horrible tourist shops selling you t-shirts and snow globes. Like, it is not a dignified place. It is very much like being in Vegas or something. So on the next page, we have the Canadian National Vimy Memorial in France. So Canada was, of course, a participant in World War I, and the most iconic battle for the Canadian side in the First World War was the Battle of Vimy Ridge. Over 3,000 Canadian soldiers died in the Battle of Vimy Ridge, which was this strategic battle to secure this important piece of territory from the Germans. And the loss of life was so dramatic, it really sort of changed the way that Canadians conceptualized a lot of things about their country. You know, the strength of its military, its relationship with Great Britain, its sort of role in the world. There was very much this sense that Canada was now, like, very clearly a country engaged in the politics of the wider world, and thus had a right to a sort of independent nationalism that was greater than had been previously in existence. You know, the only reason Canada was even fighting in World War I was because it was still technically a colony of Great Britain. So there is all this kind of like, you know, romantic notions about how like the Battle of Vimy Ridge helped Canada become a country and this sort of thing. And of course, there was